Continuing Chapter 6 of Part 7. It is a familiar fact that the sanguiferous system does sustain sudden and great changes from the influence of the passions. The glistening eye and glowing face are external indications, while the person affected, if his attention be called to his own condition, becomes conscious of coldness in his extremities, a sense of distension of the heart, difficulty of respiration, and other distressing symptoms. The effect may be so great as to superinduce death, and may be produced by any of the passions. History has many examples of death from joy. Pliny informs us of a Lacedaemonian who died of joy at hearing that his son had gained a prize in the Olympic Games. Sophocles died of joy at gaining a decision in his favor in a contest of honor. Livy mentions an aged matron who, believing her son to have been slain in battle, died in his arms in excess of joy on his safe return. Leo X died of a fever produced by joy at the news of the capture of Milan. Dr. Stroud quotes many other cases of sudden death from exciting passions, in all which we cannot doubt that the decease was caused by rupture of the heart, although for want of examination that cannot be affirmed. The following is Dr. Stroud's description of the modus. The immediate cause is a sudden and violent contraction of one of the ventricles, usually the left, on the column of blood, thrown into it by a similar contraction of the corresponding auricle, prevented from returning backwards by the intervening valve, and, not finding a sufficient outlet forwards in the connected artery, the blood reacts against the ventricle itself, which is consequently torn open at the point of greatest distension or least resistance by the influence of its own reflected force. A quantity of blood is hereby discharged into the pericardium, and having no means of escape from that capsule, stops the circulation by compressing the heart from without, and induces almost instantaneous death. In young and vigorous subjects, the blood thus collected in the pericardium soon divides into its constituent parts, namely a pale watery liquid called serum, and a soft clotted substance of a deep red color termed crassamentum. But, except under similar circumstances of extravasation, this distinct separation of the blood is seldom witnessed in the dead body, when, however, the action of the ventricle is less violent. Instead of bursting under the continued injection from the auricle, it merely dilates. But as in consequence of the over-distension, its power of contraction is speedily destroyed, death takes place with equal certainty, although perhaps with less rapidity, and in this case, as well as in the former one, the blood remaining within the heart has been divided into serum and crassamentum. Of course, there's symbolic lessons to the whole blood and water thing that's related to the whole female aspect, but let us now revert to Gethsemane. There, the sweat of Jesus was, as it were, in great drops of blood. Some passion of prodigious force was producing a serious disturbance of his circulation. Many cases of like phenomena attending like states of mind are recorded in the books. Nowadays, there's actual video of people psychosomatically causing themselves harms, like you can see marks on the body and stuff. Hervé tells of a man who, under the long-continued working of an indignation he was compelled to restrain, fell into a hemorrhagic state, attended with extreme oppression in the chest, owing to an immense enlargement of the heart and principal arteries, exhibiting a slight oozing of blood from the cutaneous vessels. The eminent French historian, the mentions the case of an Italian officer who commanded at Montmaro, a fortress of Piedmont, in the warfare between Charles V and Henry II of France in the middle of the 16th century of the Common Era, so the 1500s. This officer, having been treacherously seized by order of the hostile general and threatened with public execution unless he surrendered the place, was so agitated at the prospect of an ignominious death that he sweated blood from every part of his body. A young Florentine unjustly put to death by Pope Sixtus V, upon being led to execution, discharged blood instead of sweat from his whole body. In the German Ephemerides, many cases are given of bloody tears and bloody sweat. Maldonatus refers to a robust and healthy man at Paris who, on hearing sentence of death passed on him, was covered with bloody sweat. Schenck tells of a nun who fell into the hands of soldiers, and seeing herself encompassed with daggers and swords, threatening instant death, was so terrified that she discharged blood from every part of her body and died of hemorrhage in the sight of her assailants. So far as I know, no one has yet called attention to the fact that while sudden death may be occasioned by joy as well as by grief or terror, this phenomenon of bloody sweat has never been noticed except in connection with great mental agony. Jesus had this mental agony in Gethsemane. It seemed to be in a measure assuaged. It was renewed when he was on the cross. Did it not terminate in rupture of the heart? Many such have occurred and have been examined in which no part of the body exhibited morbid symptoms, but the heart was ruptured and the pericardium was filled with serum and crescentum, which properly are called water and blood. Indeed, the crescentum are red and clotted portions, contains all the more essential ingredients of the blood, while the serum, a more yellowish liquid, consists chiefly of water. Dr. Abercrombie of Edinburgh gives a case of the sudden death of a man aged 77 years, owing to a rupture of the heart. In his case, the cavities of the pleura contained about 3 pounds of fluid, but the lungs were sound. Dr. Eilertson relates the case of a woman who died suddenly. On opening the body, the pericardium was found distended with clear serum, and a very large coagulum of blood, which had escaped through a spontaneous rupture of the aorta near its origin, without any other morbid appearance. Many cases might be cited, but these suffice. The narrative of the last hours of Jesus, as we have already given it from the evangelists, shows such a state of mind as has produced the phenomenon of the bloody sweat, and other persons, and the water and blood which John noticed as following the soldier's spear, are such an exhibition as attends rupture of the heart, although it is more than 1,000 years after the record was made before science connected the two. Every expression of Jesus in Gethsemane is such as any man would make in describing sensations produced by the effect of mental agony on the physical constitution. On that cold night, his was not ordinary perspiration. It was the hemorrhage which agony produces. He did not die of crucifixion, he died of a broken heart, while they were crucifying him. He did not swoon, he was in full possession of his powers, as his direction to Mary and John showed. He was in full physical strength, as his loud cry showed. At 3 o'clock, if he had endured only the ordinary pains of the crucified, he might have been taken down and saved, as the Pharisees show that they proceed by desiring to have his legs broken. Pilate marveled when he had heard that Jesus was already dead. The agony of Gethsemane had a mortal tendency. The agony on the cross was a mortal blow. It was agony, not grief, not fear. If one sweats under grief or fear, it is a scant, cold sweat. If the conflict of agony, The action of the heart is violent, and sweat is abundant and warm, and in extreme cases bloody. Fear or grief paralyzes, agony supplies ordinary strength. Well, extraordinary strength. In full strength, Jesus died suddenly. The water and blood which flowed from his punctured pericardium showed that his heart had been ruptured. What was that agony? He was not afraid to die. He could have avoided death. Could he have? Could any of the four people that are pointed to as the historical Jesus have avoided death? He could raise others from the dead. He was not afraid of men. He was not afraid of God. He professed a consciousness of oneness with God. He was good. Others have loved him so that they have shouted on the cross and at the stake and died of exhaustion or fire. Happier than conquering kings. But he, so good, so humble, so free from all earthly ambitions, so unselfish, he died of a mental agony. He had no anger, no bad passion, no sudden disappointment. He had always expected to die on the cross. He had told his inmates that unless he died on the cross, his life would be a failure. He did not avoid crucifixion, and yet, although he expired on a cross, he did not die of crucifixion. He had a great spiritual conflict. In the agony thereof, his heart was ruptured. What was that agony? It is not a question for history. It is a question for each reader's heart. It could not have been an agony on account of himself. It must have been for others. For whom? That question always steps beyond the limits of history. With Jesus before his death, the work of the historian here closes. There are no circumstances recorded of the burial of Jesus, which are to be noticed as important parts of his history. If it was a history in the regular sense, right? There are two men who seem to have taken a profound interest in the career of Jesus. One was Joseph. Of him, we learn that he was of Arimathea, and that he was an honorable counselor, a rich, a good, and a just man, that he was waiting for the kingdom of God, that he had not consented to the action of the Sanhedrin in the case of Jesus, and in fact was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, for fear of the Jews. The crucified Jesus drew from him a confession of attachment which the living teacher had never been able to elicit. The other was Nicodemus. Well, let's not confuse Nicodemus with the over a century later Nicodemus, the ruler who had gone to Jesus by night, early in the career of the great teacher, and who seems never to have lost his interest in the young prophet, now come to an untimely and ignominious end. These two men took charge of the interment, while Joseph went boldly unto Pilate to crave the body of Jesus. Nicodemus went into the city to procure myrrh and aloes for his embalmment. The interest they took in Jesus shows how deeply he had impressed them. Neither had dared profess their faith in him. Well, one of the ideas was that the two with him nursed him back to health, and the aloes and stuff was part of that, right? Perhaps that faith was not well defined, but they believed him to be both great and good. They had absented themselves from the Sanhedrin, which had been called together that morning by the high priest. They knew the question to be put to them. Each was probably ignorant of the feelings of the other, but they could not vote to execute Jesus, and they had not courage to defend him. Now they discover each the other's long regard for Jesus, and they unite in showing delicate attentions to the remains of the crucified prophet. Pilate granted the body. Joseph brought a linen shroud, and Nicodemus brought the spicery. There is a pensive beauty in John's simple statement. In the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre, wherein was never man yet laid. Matthew says that the sepulchre was Joseph's own new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock. The place was near, and these good men, with pious hands, bore Jesus to it, and thus saved him from being flung into a common ditch with the malefactors who were crucified with him. They seemed to have had no helpers. The friends of Jesus had fled. His enemies had returned to the city. Alone and solitary, these honorable counselors lifted and wrapped and carried and interred the body of Jesus of Nazareth. Joseph rolled up a great stone to the door of the tomb. It was the Jews' preparation day. He and Nicodemus left the garden to prepare for the Passover. 2 women had watched these great men in their humane and godly work. Joseph and Nicodemus had not consociated with Jesus and his friends, but they were probably known as men of wealth and distinction. It must have been a wonder to these women what interest 2 members of the Senate, which had condemned Jesus, should have in the proper preparation and entombment of his body. They were too shy to address them, and probably the counselors did not notice the women. But when the great men went away, 2 humble women were left to keep love's vigil at the gate of death: Mary of Magdala and her friend Mary, the mother of Joseph. Joseph, of course, was one of the people that people say was the historical Jesus, and don't they say Barabbas? Not Barabbas. Barnabas. Is that who they call Barnabas? And even they were so thoroughly Jew that shortly they returned to the city, and having prepared further spices and ointments, they rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment. Now, they do not say in the Bible that Jesus ever said do away with the law. He said he's going to restore it, but not all the add-ons that the ecclesiastics put to it. That Sabbath day, April the 8th, 30 of the Common Era, Jesus spent in Joseph's sepulchre. And sometimes it's not the ecclesiastics, but the townspeople that kind of do something more with it.